Hello, welcome back to Bethel Evangelical Free Church Handling on YouTube. I'm Pastor Gervais Charmley, and this is in the nature of an appendage to the video on Little Gidding. This is the Church of St Mary, Leighton Bromswold, which is not that far from Little Gidding. It's a 13th century church, cruciform, that was rebuilt, partially rebuilt in the 1620s. About the same time that Little Gidding Church was built. And it was rebuilt because the tower fell down, because that's what towers do if you don't look after them. They're quite tall, of course, you get the influence of the wind more, and it came down and had to be rebuilt. And so what you see behind me is mostly 13th century, apart from that wonderful tower that dates from the 17th century. It's one of the guiding men here in the rebuild is George Herbert, the Anglican poet and briefly country clergyman, who is very much the same kind of milieu, if you will, for want of a better word, the same kind of milieu as the Little Gidding family. He is not exactly a Laudian, he's not a Calvinist, he's very much a man for peace. Laud, of course, is not much of a man for peace. But this is a very interesting example of a church of a period where there's not an awful lot now. Yes, mostly it's 13th century, but when we go inside, we shall see why it's so interesting from a 17th century perspective. So let's do that now. So here we are inside St Mary's, Leighton Bromswold. You'll notice immediately the 17th century pulpit behind me. But if I move in this direction, you'll notice the other 17th century pulpit. One of the unusual features about this building is it has two 17th century pulpits. They both come from that 1620s rebuild that was necessitated after the tower came down. It was quite conservative. Now, unfortunately, the Victorians have done what the Victorians did. They took the plaster off the walls, so the result is a building that has been rather scraped. Thankfully, it's this quite light-coloured local stone. It's not like one of these buildings, like some of these buildings where basically they've taken all the plaster off and they've exposed very dark stone underneath, and so you get this gloomy building. The other thing is that there's no stained glass here. There's a little bit of that Victorian coloured glass, but no, I don't think there is actually. I think there's just glass that needs cleaning. But there we are. So let's have a look at the inside of this little building. I say little, of course, it's actually quite large. It's one of these big cruciform village churches, and there we are. There's the pulpits. You can see the woodwork here is basically by the same people who did the woodwork at Little Gidding. It's the same kind of local oak, of course. The pulpits, Little Gidding's lost its pulpit. It had a pulpit. The loss of the pulpit actually has given Little Gidding very much a much more monastic feel than actually it was intended to have. But that's Little Gidding. This is Leighton Bromswold. We pan up, and there's the roof. And again, you can see 17th century roof. All been replaced in the 17th century, and very well done, actually. We'll move forward a bit, just trying to keep a bit level and steady. Get the two pulpits there. Now, this reflects that, for want of a better word, because really when we think about high church, we tend to think today about the Victorians, but for want of a better word, it's a high church approach, 17th century, continuity with the medieval Catholic Church. They would have had the communion table at the East End, but it would have been probably table-wise with the priest, with the minister speaking from the north side. It's altar-wise now, and the rails, although they're in a cod Jacobean style, they are not Jacobean, because Jacobean rails would be much closer. We'll pan around here, so adjust the camera angle for the benches. You can see the No box pews, you'll notice, but benches. Again, this is part of this. We are trying to be have it to be in continuity with the medieval church. And we've got the font, which is a rather interesting thing. It's a column-wise. Is it the head of a column? Is it a medieval font? Is it a 17th century font? I mean, certainly the cover's 17th century, but a lot of font covers are 17th century. The medieval ones tended to wear out, and they weren't suited for the sort of post-Reformation services. And more benches. You'll notice the church warden's staves. Those are very important. They're when the bishop visits. You also notice here, incidentally, as if we pan around, and you'll learn again, that there's a very, very broad aisle. Now, why is that? Is this simply a matter of, well, we want to have extra space in the aisle? No, this is because you would have had benches for the poor, and when I say benches, I mean in the sense of those benches perhaps with an open back or with no back at all, and the poor people would have sat on these benches in the middle. Now, of course, that's all long since gone, and so we have a nice broad aisle. So that's Leighton Bromswold, St Mary's. Like a lot of these big medieval churches, we've got a couple of memorials there. They're not accessible. The bier is in the way, and you've got the missing men and the First World War commemoration in there. Yes, there is the bier that's used for carrying coffins, and you can see we have a transept, so 2 transepts, and there again you can see just how broad that centre aisle is. This is an aisle where, and I think that the carpet pretty much indicates the sort of space you'd have had, and in the middle there would have been the seats for the poor, and at the west end there is the tower arch. Now that tower is basically 17th century. The arch, just see the squared off piers at the bottom, and in spite of that pointed arch, that is a 17th century arch, and beyond those round headed very 17th century windows. The pulpits again with their testers, and testers are again, it's a very important part of the 17th century. And there we are, there's the chancel. So progress very slowly into the chancel. I don't have wheels on my tripod, so I have to hold the tripod. And you see how light it is, because there is no stained glass. In the Middle Ages, these big windows would have been filled with glass, but the glass has gone the way of all flesh, as they say. There we have the rather wonderful twin piscina with its interlaced arches above. The lectern here in the chancel, you see there with the aumbry, the cupboard behind it, that is 17th century, at least by the look of things, either that or it's an imitation. And it's certainly it's the kind of thing that George Herbert would have known. And as we pan around, we have there the choir stalls, again 17th century, and look through there, you can see how the 2 pulpits are visible in the chancel arch. And as we pan upwards, you'll be able to see the mark where there used to be, where the roof was before the chancel walls were heightened to allow for these huge windows to go in. See, one of the things is these huge windows today, what they create is a kind of lantern effect, that this is a space that is filled with light. But originally, they would have created a kind of jeweled lantern effect they would have been filled with stained glass. There are still a few churches where you can find some medieval glass, and Victorian glass doesn't generally give a good impression of what the medieval glass looked like. Medieval glass tended to be, well, it was rather different from what the Victorians wanted it to be. We have here a monument to a former vicar. This is in loving remembrance of the faithful ministry of Thomas Ladd's M.A., vicar of this parish for 50 years, 1849 to 1899. Jesus Master, have mercy on us. So let's move into the corner here to have a better look at these choir stalls. And once again, at this point, that this reflects that George Herbert Anglo-Catholicism kind of. It's not imitating Rome, it's not trying to get back to Rome, it's not the kind of thing that you find in the 19th century when you get people trying to copy modern, by modern I was 19th century, post-Reformation, Roman Catholic devotional practices, Roman Catholic services. It's rather this idea that we are in continuity with the historic church, the Western Catholic Church. That's the terminology that they would use. It's the correct terminology to use. And they say, well, we're in continuity with this, and so why should we behave as though only Rome is Catholic? And in fact, one of the things that you get someone like George Herbert going is, well, Rome isn't Catholic enough. Here we are, this is the screen. You've noticed there is a chancel screen. Now, this wasn't unusual because in the Elizabethan church, when you had your Puritan movement, particularly your Puritan type Elizabethan churches, what you'd have very often is the chancel would become the place where you have communion. And at communion, you'd have a table down the middle of the chancel. So let's swing around to have a look at the table here. You'd have a table in the middle of the chancel, table-wise, that is to say, with its narrow ends facing east and west. And then you would have seating around it, so they would sit around the table. And that's all that the chancel would be used for. It would be used for the communion service, and that would be it. And sometimes in the 18th century, particularly the 18th century, you get this movement where you'll get the pulpit actually will stand post in the middle, in front of the chancel, and so you have to go around the back of the chancel to get to the table. Now, people like George Herbert, they say would never have done that because they wanted to emphasize this point that the communion table, the communion, is at the center. It should be at the center in Christian worship. That we're not doing services that are simply word-based. Now, they are word-based, and Christian says it should be word-based, but that the communion, and now one of the things that happened in the 19th century, you get the recovery with, among other people, the Brethren, but also people like Charles Haddon Spurgeon. They have weekly communion in Baptist churches, in Congregational churches, Presbyterian churches, Anglican churches, Methodist churches, where they can. Of course, Methodists, you've got a different thing going on. Why is it that you have weekly communion? Well, weekly communion is, to emphasize this point, that the communion service is not something that we just do because we have to or because we think it's a good idea. It's an important part of Christian worship. It's one of the issues that we've had with the COVID business is communion being interrupted because a government that is very largely post-Christian, although of course it includes people who are believers and people who belong to Christian traditions, but you have a situation where the authorities don't understand these things, and partly don't understand these things because we've made it harder for them to do so. So we will process forward now. So the interesting thing with this building is precisely it is this 17th century church interior, at least as far as the furnishings are concerned, and this George Herbert, and just like Little Gidding, it reflects an element of the Anglican tradition that has disappeared, an element that disappears pretty quickly after the Civil War, because the Civil War has had this problem that you've got on the one hand the Puritans, and on the other hand you have the Lord, and of course Lord himself is executed for treason. But then the 18th century, you get this reaction, well, we had a war of religion back in the 17th century. Therefore, fanaticism, and the word they use is enthusiasm, is deplored. And even George Herbert comes under the heading of people who are a little bit, they take their religion a bit too seriously. My opinion is no such thing as taking these things too seriously, but there we are. Well, let's go outside, just have a look at the tower before we conclude this video, because the tower is extremely interesting here. So the tower, English parish church towers are really of two kinds, the kind with a steeple and the kind without, and this is the kind without. But this is 17th century, and so we rise up, we see the round-headed windows, the square-headed window, more round-headed windows, and then we have the pinnacles. Now, in a medieval church, they'd be pinnacles with crockets, but this, of course, is 17th century, so they're obelisks with balls on top, which I find, okay, it's you trying to use these medieval forms, but with a sort of Renaissance twist to them, if you will. So extremely fascinating. So there we are, Leighton Bromswold, Huntingdonshire, George Herbert, 17th century building. Excuse the local dog barking in the background. Hark, hark, the dogs do bark. So we'll leave it there. As I say, it's a very beautiful building and one much to appreciate. So thank you very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed it, and hope that you continue to watch these things as I try to improve my skills with making these things. Thank you very much. God bless you and keep you.